Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 13th episode of the Magnum Opi podcast. It is unlucky for some, and it seems it's unlucky for us because there's just me and Brandig, and I believe very soon may just be me. So this week we read Serotonin, and as you can see by the mass exit of participants, there was a general disliking of this book. Is that fair to say, Brandig?
I think that's a fair and accurate statement. And I think read it should be quoted with air quotes because I don't know that a great many people finished the book. There were general fall-offs around pages 100 and 200.
Yes. Was there any particular incident that triggered your fall-off, or?
It was his decision to basically abandon whatever it was that he considered a family, or any positive, beneficial participation in society, or just an abrogation of responsibility in general. Although that was after the shocking tryst of his quote unquote, I don't know whether it should be called his wife, his concubine, his lover, or what have you. But her participation with varied sexual activities of the not specific specially.
Yeah, his Japanese succubus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning from Texas, by the way.
Yes, I'll start with a quick plot summary, and then I'll hand the floor to Brandig to see what may have caused a mass exit. So, in Serotonin, we have the protagonist, whose name I always struggle to remember. Oh, look, coming in from the sideline, we have Justine.
Hello, sorry, I'm late.
No, that's you're more than welcome. So I was just about to do a plot summary. So Florent Claude, the protagonist, is 46 and essentially a miserable old bastard with nothing to live for, at least seemingly. And he actively just decides to continue this instead of changing for the better. So he decides to essentially leave his old life behind and travel from hotel to hotel, revisiting painful memories of the past, revisiting a friend, which doesn't end well, and eventually dying, although not necessarily dying. Brandig, what do you think?
Well, that's not really my recollection of the plot, such as it was. It was basically French bureaucrat grows up in the lap of luxury, gets appointed to a lifetime job in the bureaucracy, and realizes that earthly pleasures are fleeting, and when one pals around with people who are hedonists, one should expect general commoditization of relationships, and then rejects basically the value of life and goes on a trip to basically abandon adulthood and enjoy childhood again before he decides to kill himself. However, when he gets to the point where he's about to kill himself, he realizes that, well, if I kill myself, I'm actually going to be leaving money behind. So I'm going to put off killing myself until I run out of money, and then I'll kill myself. Ta-da!
Let's not forget the Japanese girlfriend.
I would like to.
It's very hard to.
It's kind of set up as an escape from the Japanese girlfriend, right? Like that's the trigger in a way, although it's a lot more than that. But he has this cold, I guess, younger Japanese girlfriend who, as it turns out, is wildly unfaithful to him. And he discovers several videos on her phone that show that she's dramatically unfaithful to him. With like, not only does she have, well, there's a lot of, kind of dark comedy in this novel, and that he's reeling from the fact that the video shows her essentially having sex with about 15 guys or something, and then he recognizes the decor, which is his house. And then it gets worse.
I'm glad you mentioned the dark comedy, because I do think this is something that is not appreciated by some people. This isn't to sound snobbish and say that they don't like it because they don't appreciate the comedy part, but I do think that part of it is a tragic comedy of the most tragic proportions possible. It's kind of presented as something that's so bleak that the comedy comes from the bleakness.
But his commentary is so, I mean, I was laughing out loud, in various spots. Apparently, his his offhand comments about different not even racial, national groups, for example, right? What did he say about the Dutch are just?
I've memorized this because this quote is I think an example of why Houellebecq is a good writer, which I would contend after going through a bit of an emotional a roller coaster with the book. He describes them as polyglottal tradespeople or something like that. Opportunistic polyglottal tradespeople.
As to the Dutch, they were really a bunch of slags. I mean, Holland isn't a country; it's a business. He calls them slags because not just because they were in a cafeteria and some of them kept to themselves, but I think the Dutch were talking to everybody. But
yes, well, he says that the Dutch can't be xenophobic because it's kind of a contradiction in terms.
The purpose of there's a lot of amusing sort of lines along those lines, and I mean, Huelobeck, to me, he's a reactionary, perhaps slightly manqué, but he's definitely a reactionary. There's a gigantic Christianity-shaped hole in all of his work, which he's aware of. And he always juxtaposes in a way that is, often shocking, but intentionally so. He juxtaposes the religious references with some crass, like, reference to pornography or something like that,
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
For example, he goes to see a doctor who prescribes him antidepressants, and he's has to get through Christmas somehow, and the guy says, oh well, right, I'm in the habit of keeping people alive during this period, or my business is to keep people alive, and this is the toughest period. So he says he was thinking of going to a monastery for the Christmas period, but there was all booked up, so the alternative is to go to like a whorehouse in Thailand. So that type of thing where it's obvious, like, from knowing Huelobeck like I do, he always brings up this lack in French society, because again, there's this hole. And I'm sorry if I'm babbling on. I just came back from France, and I have a lot to say.
I'm sorry.
Yes, so as I said at the beginning, I went through a bit of a roller coaster with the book. When I first picked it up, I enjoyed it. I thought, I'm going to prove everyone wrong. People that are questioning it, why do they not like it? Then it gets to I think, the shock for shock's sake, and that is where I started to dislike it. But after that lump of the first third after the beginning, that's when it picked back up again to me, and I ended the book actually really appreciating it, which is, I think, maybe an opinion only had between me and you, Justine, because the reason I think it does have value is the fact that he is a man that realizes that materialism means nothing, but has nothing to fill the gap that was previously filled by materialism. He can't. He just can't find it in himself to reach out to anything else. But he knows that. There's a section in which he kind of pokes fun at this, where he talks about sort of Stoic philosophy and where this idea that being completely devoid of materialism and completely devoid of want is sort of philosophically appreciated in some ideas, but he's doing it in jest, kind of saying it's not that he's achieved this nirvana in which he's devoid of want. It's because he's so depressed that he has no want anymore. This is why, to me, he is an intelligent writer, and it took me a while to get into that mindset, and I understand why people don't like him. But I did end the book having a large appreciation for it.
I mean, if you know, I mean, I know the kind of, do you know what the Soixante-Huitards are in France? 68 was the big kind of cultural Marxist rebellion in France. You know, there was a kind of almost a revolution, like, of student uprisings in France, you know, and the kind of typical, like, boomer French, you know, they have a very specific quality, and I'm familiar with that side. When I go to France, I'm usually, like, the people I know are more on that team, but I'm always trying to kind of break through to the other side. There's a reference to les deux France, the two Frances, and essentially in France, the two Frances are those who sympathize with the French Revolution, or, you know, and kind of its equivalent movements like 68, and the France that was destroyed and or, you know, still actively disapproves of the French Revolution. So the throne and altar.
So you've got the communists on one side and the national statists on the other. And imperialists, I guess, might be a better characterization.
The old, but, you know, the old monarchists still exist, and the Catholic Church still exists. They're in a state of disarray. There's no doubt about that. You also have other, you know, you've got the Front National and people like that as well. That's a different.
Remind me again what positive things have come out of France.
Well, I'm a throne and altar type myself, so I sympathize with the monarchist Catholic position, and there is. I've said this before, that we're so much of our malaise has come out of France, right? Like, a lot of our present. You know, not only the French Revolution and its effects, but also, like, the cultural, you know, some very specific schools of cultural Marxism that have infected the American and other Anglo universities in a big way, right? Like the Derrida, Foucault, you know, crowd.
Camus, which is apropos of Huelobeck.
Yeah, absolutely. But he's opposed to them.
Well, yes, this is where he slightly differentiates. Yeah.
Yeah. Huelobeck is opposed to them. In fact, they all hate him. They really hate him because he sneers at the left, and he sneers at the 68, and he doesn't really see a differentiation between the communists and I guess liberal democracies. And he's very he's the kind of guy, like, if you're seen reading Houellebecq in France, you might get people kind of shouting at you. You know, he's quite controversial, actually, in France. Like, people that I know will, you know, I'll say, "Ooh, I've read Houellebecq, he's really good," and they're like, "I refuse to read that." You know, not because
I side with the people who refuse to read him.
Well, I think you might be missing a trick here. I mean, it's not. I know that you don't like reading things which are
without a point. or serve to only highlight their point by exaggeration.
Diagnose a bad situation without offering an alternative. Well, I understand that that's your position, but I do think that there is a function, especially for the other team, really, like for the left, in seeing this kind of thing laid out, because they tend to skate over it, and they also tend to think that it has nothing to do with them, the like present conundrums that we find ourselves in. They like to think that somehow it's not their fault, or they like to kind of even like just say commodification that he's pointing to here, in the way that a certain type of like neoliberalism liberalism aligns perfectly with liberalism in human relations, in that there's this atomization. It's easy to throw people away and get rid of them. Everybody's reduced to what they can do for you. Those.
Brandig, do you want to say why you don't like it? Put up the defense for team anti-Huelobeck.
I just read it.
Because it's dark and it shows this unpleasant situation, right? And he wants to see something more inspiring, and he wants it.
I don't see the value in telling somebody a story without a logical conclusion or a lesson that can be drawn from it, because there's no contrasting character in this story that can be lionized. There's literally and I will firmly state, I read the first 100 pages and the last 10 pages. And the reason I read the last 10 pages is I wanted to see if there was any kind of a change in the character between the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And the only change was the decision to make to squander his inheritance completely before he kicked, offed himself. So there's no positive message from this book. There's no contrast. This is purely a painting of a degenerate person falling into degeneracy, recognizing the shallowness of degeneracy, and then not coming to any kind of a realization or education or learning, just a desire to end it, and to not end it in such a way as to benefit anyone. So everything must be squandered before this is a 2-year-old coming across a game, and they can't continue to play it, or they can't figure out a way to win the game. So rather than deciding that they want to quit the game and maybe play something else, they go and start taking the pieces of the game and throwing them down a well, and they get tired about halfway through, but then they realize that if they don't finish throwing all the pieces down the well, then someone else might play that game in the future. So they decide to sigh and press on and say, okay, I'll throw the rest of the pieces down the well, and then the book ends.
Well, this is, again, where I think it's just a disagreement on what we consider, the purpose of literature, maybe, because I do think that there is a person that you can contrast him to, and it's the reader. He's never presented as someone that should be emulated.
No, that's for sure.
So it's kind of a diagnosis through this character study. But everything that it reads like France's suicide note, and that's the kind of impression I get from every one of his books, that it's just kind of so long to what we've known, and it doesn't necessarily provide answers, but I don't think everything has to.
I think his sort of diagnosis is so different from his political kind of enemies that it's worth making, even if the next steps, hopefully the next steps are more, more to cultivate something and to go in a more positive direction. But this sort of thing needs to be said to these people, and
So a fair approximation would be someone keeps going to various different doctors, and the first 9 doctors they go to say, "Nah, you're fine. It's no problem." And the 10th doctor says, "Yeah, this is lethal. It's going to kill you." But none of the 10 doctors actually provides you any kind of a prescription for actually, getting better.
well, this you seem to be having this experience on the regular, man. I mean, no.
I wouldn't mind terribly if this book were basically read and popularized and communicated as a warning to France about the inevitable, the result of their current geopolitical position and their philosophical bend. But it's not. It's being lionized as great French literature and, the epitome of popular French, this, that, and the other thing. And without any context of the message it's actually sending. If it were couched in any way as a, hey, this is the logical conclusion of nihilism, stay away, then I'd be okay with it as an example of what not to do. But and Albion, you normally have a slide on critic response, and unless I'm misreading the quotes that I saw on the cover, this is being put up and publicized as great literature, and there's nothing about a warning from the great Houellebecq about the consequences of the direction of France.
I think
Okay,
he
sorry.
expects us to draw that conclusion without,
People are stupid.
Yes. Well,
as evidenced by France.
Now
can I ask a question? Sorry, just to kind of give a comparison. Do you think that an oil painting of hell, a scene in hell, can be beautiful, even if it's not actively saying at the bottom of the painting, well, you don't want to end up here. You shouldn't be. You shouldn't transgress and end up in hell. Just the painting itself is a depiction of a scene in hell.
I don't think I'd ever say that painting would be beautiful. I could say it would be grotesque,
sublime.
Which is the identifying the beauty in just twistedness. But that is not something that one says that this is a beautiful piece of work. I can say it's technically proficient, but it is a grotesquerie, and it is not something to be publicized and spread without context or without an approbation that this is not what you want.
But isn't it a warning in and of itself? I mean, if you use that analogy to a picture of people suffering in hell, right? They're suffering in hell.
Yeah, maybe beauty was the wrong word, but you get the analogy I'm making.
Yeah, that it's a worthy piece of art, and I think Houellebecq. I agree that he's showing us somebody suffering in hell. I'd like to go. I mean, let's just break it. Like, I think there are some things in here which are worth noting, such as his discussion of women. Okay, it's hard to look past the pornographic parts, and in fact, I actively try because I'm. I think I actively try to sort of skate my eyes over parts where it's like too graphic.
Yeah, I think that there's sections where it doesn't need to, it could be toned down.
Perhaps the child pornography part of it.
I think, yeah, for example, but even just a lot of just like, but I do think that he describes, there's an interesting part where he says some people will say that I'm too obsessed with sex or something like that, right? But I think he's trying to get, first of all, he tries to get at what happens with let's say good sex, or that there's a meeting of some kind. Now, I think and that there's that has something to do with love, and then he talks about like love as well in this book. You know, he talks about, like, he describes some moments where he's happy, and there's some, right, I think he more than his other books, actually, he makes more of an effort to describe something like marital bliss in a few instances. Like with Camille, I believe he says she made a home, and because she made it her own, she made it mine also, and things like that, right? Where he says, you know, I could have told her, I wanted to ask her to be my wife, or I could have asked her to be my wife, but in the modern age, you know, the modern male is supposed to value a woman's career over everything, so I didn't do that, right? But he gestures at these things, or he knew that he could find happiness with a woman, but the modern age has like abolished that kind of happiness, right? And he sees little glimpses of it, and he actually does. I think he does try to describe love and what it, you know, what, like, I mean, married love, you know, even though I think he does try to grasp that, you know. That's just one example that, you know, he contrasts somebody like the Japanese girl who doesn't seem to love him, and, you know, they don't seem to love each other, with some women, you know, where he takes a tour of his past, both literally goes and meets women, and he also kind of reviews times from his past where he had love and could have cultivated it and could have made something, but instead he lost it, you know. And it's partly to do with him and partly to do with the culture that produces these kinds of atomizing situations, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's an important element, is that it's both the culture that he's in, but it's also because of his own mistakes.
Yeah,
I think, again, this is part of the reason why people disliked it, is because he is in some ways a very unlikable character. But again, I don't necessarily think that everything we have to read has to have you know, shining beacons of morality. Sometimes you can extract through watching these kind of people a moral lesson.
Yeah, you could extract lessons about love, like if you see love hovering before you and the chance, you know, to make a life of somebody, you should take that. And also, like, you shouldn't you know, you shouldn't like cheat on that person, and you shouldn't also think to yourself, well, I won't ask her to be my wife because that wouldn't be very modern of me, or something, you know, things like that. I think he does, you know, he's not very good at making a good life for himself, but he has like a consciousness of the chances that he missed and why.
Yeah, it's a reflection on why he's in the state that he's in.
Yeah, so I really do think there's, like I said, like there's a Christianity shaped hole in the book, and he you know, he talks about, like, even when he talks about Catholics, like there was a Catholic who died and he was a practicing Catholic, and so because of that, he, you know, the priest was able to give a sermon that meant something and send him to send him to heaven, kind of thing. He's not sneering at, he's just not able to get there himself.
That's a good point. And I mean, death is one of the main themes of the book. I mean, before we go on to anything like that, Brandy, is there anything you want to say? Or
well, circling back to the start of the book, the character reflects on his past, and the expressions used by him refer to all of the decisions that were made in absentia or on his behalf or because of the prevailing conditions at the time. And then the only time, at least in the book, that a part of the book that I read, and this is what really decided me to put it down and say enough of this crap. He the first time in his life, he decides he wants to take agency and make a decision on his own for himself. That decision is to abandon his entire life, abandon all of his relationships, abandon all of his responsibilities, and go off and find himself and eat, pray, love, or whatever the French equivalent of it is, but so that he can, then die and kill himself. It's just a complete and total abrogation of the responsibilities of an adult, and a rejection of any positive value for contributing to one's life, one's family, and one's society.
I think
this is the epitome of the life of a leech that realizes that the blood tastes stale at this point.
I think he could have fleshed out a bit more how hard it might be to get rid of the Japanese girl, just in terms of the problem. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I thought that was intentional. I think this shows how deracinated it is, because in order for him to essentially die, because I don't think it's him going away to find himself. I do actually think it's him retreating into a hole to die already. He is essentially dead from the beginning of the book, for all intents and purposes.
I don't know that he was ever alive.
Well, and that could be argued.
Let's meditate on serotonin.
But I think that him easily escaping is kind of the point. And he even mentions this himself later on when it is kind of wrapping up, that he describes himself as an animal that's kind of been mortally wounded and finding a place to rest until it dies. That is the whole book, that it's kind of already too late for him to change, because he's already dead.
I think it's kind of intriguing that the well-known side effect that he mentions of antidepressants is a loss of libido and impotence, and so he becomes he had this kind of like sex addiction, I guess, or something like that.
I mean, he was French.
Yes, he is. There's that. I mean, maybe it's not, because he has other. There's I mentioned before his book Atomized, or sometimes the Elementary Particles, where there are two brothers. There's half brothers, and one is an actual sex addict, much worse than this guy, and another one who is sort of very cold and asexual, and they both have a different their mother was a swinging 60s hippie and neglected them, and then they kind of react in opposite ways. One is kind of grabbing after every passing female, and the other can't love even though he has a woman who's in love with him, he can't love her. But both of them are atomized in a similar kind of way, because one is just taking one woman after the other, and not getting attached to anyone. The other one can't form an attachment. This character, go ahead.
Sorry, I just say I think both of them are responses to a separation of sex and love. I think, and that's something that Houellebecq gets at quite a lot.
Yeah. Well, he actually says in that book that John Paul II was the only man in the Western world who knew what was going on with sex and love. And he was referring to a famous encyclical called The Theology of the Body, where John Paul II discusses this problem, and tries to explain what has happened, and how we should properly approach these matters in a way that unifies sex and love. So it's a wonderful, wonderful work. So as I say, he does have, he always makes these explicit references. And there's always a sense that something huge has been lost, right? And I think I mentioned before that, that one of the reasons that the left in France is so defiant and so gross about their how they like to they always go all the way. They have to sign famously sign petitions that say that children should be allowed to have sex and blah blah blah, right? That I think part of that is that France was such a sacred place for so long, and it was so it was the one of the like the jewel of Christendom in terms of practice and beauty and this ancient sacred culture. They, when they had to overthrow it, and in the French Revolution and onwards, they had to be so disgusting about it, right? They had to eat aristocrats in the street, because that was their way to overcome this extremely sacred place. So I think the same is evident in Houellebecq, except that he's not celebrating that. He's pointing to what's been lost, and there's still vestiges of it. It's not as though it's completely lost. How about agriculture? What were your thoughts about why agriculture is such a big theme in this novel?
Well, I don't know if Brandick, you probably didn't. The whole farmer situation probably wasn't even mentioned by the time you
well, he was in charge of agriculture in some form or fashion. He was in agriculture something or another and whatnot. And the reason he went into agriculture was because it was what he considered to be consistent and easy, if I'm remembering correctly.
He also works for Monsanto at one stage, and there's a lot of humorous references to how this would shock his, Bobo. That's what they say in France.
Yeah, his constituents and his, the people who put him in his office. Yeah.
I don't think it's just for it to be easy. He does have a genuine passion when he's talking to his doctor, who starts talking about endocrinology. He does seem to recall a time in which he did care for his job, but because he had to sell his soul to work for big business, he no longer has that passion.
Well, he doesn't.
But
in that case, he doesn't understand agriculture, because the only way that society is able to feed the people it feeds today is because of GMOs and chemical fertilizer, and you do not get the current yields that we have with our current agricultural processes without massive modification of the genome and massive modification of the environment and crop rotations, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And
actually, he talks about, like, he says, he's in favor of. He's not against industrialization. It's that he does think that there are some practices, like we mentioned crop rotation, right? He says that in some places they've abandoned crop rotation and they need to reintroduce it. So it goes into it in some detail, right?
And he's pretty fair-handed with the GMO situation, because he says there's not anything to say that it's necessarily negative, but there's also nothing to say that it isn't negative. But he's kind of saying this discussion can't be had because the decision's already been made. And I think that, sure, from a quantity perspective, maybe we do need this, but his concerns kind of lie with the average French farmer and with the quality of the produce actually being made.
Because he's French.
I don't. Sometimes quantity isn't everything.
Yeah, quantity is not. I think there can be, maybe we can find a reconciliation between some of these dueling concerns, right? In terms of agriculture, but I kind of wonder if part of it is that it's a deeply French kind of question,
I agree with that. This entire book is very deeply French.
Yes, but I think part of it could have to do with the implication or the analogy to the human world, that maybe our present order, how our present order manages human beings, and perhaps some of the same reductive practices are being brought to bear. I think that's part of it. There's a.
Well, that just goes back to your same circular criticism about the Christianity shaped hole in France, and that this is the logical conclusion of communism / nihilism. When you start commoditizing everything, including people, this is the result.
Is it only communism, though? I mean, isn't some forms of liberalism also include this type of?
Liberalism, when taken to its extreme, will result in communism, at least from the left perspective. Liberalism, when taken to the right extreme, results in anarchy.
So it's the right, but when I say liberalism, I don't mean it in the sense of the American left so much as
the classic liberalism,
right.
classical liberalism is basically the fundamental scientific approach to everything. And that leads into two directions. One, everything is eminently controllable, which is the left liberal position, which results in communism and nihilism. And then there's the right perspective of fundamentally there's a limit to your level of control, and we don't know that limit without empirical experimentation. So consequently, everyone must be allowed to experiment individually to find their own individual limits, which means that we cannot have broad control over mass segments of the society. Consequently, we have anarchy, and people are allowed to make their own individualized specific decisions based upon their own best evaluations at that time.
Is that your kind of more or less where you are right now?
Yes. Now, I do underpin that. I do underpin that with some consistent, common ad arguendum laws, such as law of gravity, law of thermodynamics, etc. The social laws are basically freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and right to property, and right to life, and right to liberty. So you apply certain universal standards as your baseline and allow experimentation based on those standards.
I wonder if do you like ever worry, considering the kind of direction that the United States is going, and like that this could be an outgrowth of that, which might seem benign and at one stage in history, but
what?
Ever worry that what you're describing is like that you can't separate it from this leftist direction? That it is leftist?
No, I don't. And that's because I operate from a basic constrained vision and an understanding of the limitations that humans have.
So like a la what's the fellow? The Tragic Vision, kind of?
Not particularly.
Thomas Sowell?
Well, it's not a tragic vision. So the Sowell's position is the constrained vision, in that humans are humans, or humans are going to human.
He does use the word tragic, though, as well. He just means that there's, that human life has a tragic dimension that is, it affects it adds up to the same thing.
Well, fundamentally, it's a limitation on understanding, and until and unless you can understand everything at all points in all places within the universe, something fundamentally impossible while within said universe, one can't predict with accuracy. So the less one understands, the more inaccurate the predictions one makes. So the more one understands, the better for the prediction model. It's the same fundamental basis for scientific accuracy when you're talking about motion dynamics.
I think he uses the term tragic as a sort of allusion to post Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Sort of the downfall has already happened. Sort of representation of humans.
So we're not perfectible, and we've
Yeah.
But there's a corrupt.
Yes, that's fine. I don't consider that to be a tragedy.
Right, but that is the term that he uses, the tragedy.
Okay, well, the believe for him.
Okay.
So, well, that was the title card. The slides probably aren't going to be particularly necessary because we just
covered
quite a good conversation. So here's the man himself.
Dr. Siggy.
Yes, I've never seen someone smoke with those two fingers. I'd use the index and middle finger, not that just seems really awkward. But anyway, a quote here from Platform, one of his other novels, which I think is quite a good summary of some of the characters in his works. there's a lot of philosophical floundering, which is kind of the point. So I just want to go on to the influences a minute. Now, I didn't see any express acknowledgement of his influence by Camus, but I think it's kind of obvious. They're both actually French Algerian, which I didn't know about Houellebecq.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I think that that's not his name that he grew up with. I believe it's in that family name.
I think it's Thomas. He was born with something like that. So yeah, no, he did adopt it as a
it's
just for writing.
Mother's, it's some aunt's name or something like that. Maybe he's just trying to be difficult and have the most unspellable name ever.
I mean, given his character, that wouldn't be a surprise.
There's a kind of sense of extinction, things going extinct in the novel, and one of the things that's going extinct is smoking, right? So he there's an amusing kind of situation where he's looking, he needs to find a hotel that still allows people to smoke, which could have allowed his Japanese ex to track him down, to be honest. Right?
She did seem like the type that would do that as well. But yeah, that's a good point. And it's funny because Houellebecq seems to, not want to fall into archetypes, but I mean, he is the most obvious representation of a postmodern French author that you could think of. But aside from Camus, Lovecraft, which is an interesting one, until I kind of stopped and thought about and watched some content and read a bit more, and I see the connection now as there being a sort of existential horror, but the horror is not Cthulhian gods. It is sort of just modernity, post-religious modernity is the oppressive existential crisis as opposed to the old ones.
Well, that's absolutely typical of the murder of God and the replacement of God with man. Man is the horror, and at the same time, so there we don't need old gods. We've got man, and man is more dangerous and more terrible than the old gods could ever be.
Oh, see, we've converted you to Houellebecq already.
There you go.
Just because I understand it doesn't mean I agree with it.
Now, the other miserable git that we have on here is Schopenhauer, but I don't really know much about him apart from he was anti-German idealism from memory. Sorry, carry on.
Here's a line. Just to go back to the quote of Western civilization managed to separate procreation from sex. It would condemn not only procreation but sex. I think that it's like back to he's talking about how if you separate these two things, you end up not only losing, the procreative side of society, but the pleasure. He actually talks about how the danger of falling pregnant, which is one way to look at it, a danger.
Yeah, Albion and I were talking before the stream about fertility rates.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's very much apropos here. I mean, I think that relates back to the farming thing, right? Is that the management of the farm kind of thing is similar problems, or certain problems are arising in the management of the humans by, let's say, I don't know, elites or the bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a separation of the act from the sort of the consequences of the act with birth control, and he does have a little section on that.
There's a funny thing in France. There's a day called St. Catherine's. It celebrates St. Catherine of Alexandria, and it's traditionally a day to celebrate young womanhood, so virgins and young women who want to get married, and it's in the 1960s, oddly enough, it basically kind of went extinct as a celebration.
Can't imagine why.
Well, yeah, weird, because no one wanted to celebrate virginity anymore.
All that is beautiful must be destroyed.
Indeed.
because by its very existence, it demands comparison.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy there.
So here I've put on a
He's
common.
smoking it the same way.
He doesn't like his first name because it's too feminine sounding.
So this is a common issue that comes up, is that people do tend to put the author as narrator with Houellebecq, because every character he writes as the protagonist is a misanthropic middle-aged man. Whilst there's elements of him that do come through on the characters, I do think it's a mistake to put him solely as the protagonist.
Yeah, I think so too. Because, well, for one thing, I don't think Houellebecq ever really worked in a bureaucracy. He seems to have been
he seems pretty opposed.
Yeah. He used to live in Ireland. He may still live in Ireland.
No, he did move back. So I think this was around the time that he ended up making a mockumentary about his kidnap, because he disappeared for a while after the publication of I believe it was either Platform or Submission. He moved away to Ireland, and I think over there he had a very poor internet connection, so he just wasn't present online for a few months, and people thought that he had been kidnapped, and he ended up making a film, the sort of meta joke on it was a documentary about him being kidnapped. Again, there's this constant ribbing that comes from him, but it's from the darkest place possible. It's there is humor in there, but it's subtle.
His thing with Monsanto was he'd moved into a like a a bourgeois bohemian kind of building, and he had to lie about where he worked, because all the sort of all the bobos would have disapproved so much, because it sort of fake environmentalism is kind of their religion, or it's part of their religion. So that was one of the amusing parts. I think he might have quit Monsanto just so and gone to work for somebody else, part of it because of it.
And try and sell artisanal cheeses.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just actually something that I noticed whilst I was doing the research for his influences. The character is 46, and there's a few references dotted throughout of authors that have previously died at or killed themselves at 46, and Lovecraft died at the age of 46. So I think it was a bit of an homage, because his essays on Lovecraft is what first kind of broke him through for his nonfiction anyway.
Wow.
It's I'm going to get my hands on it and take a look, because it seems like an interesting kind of analysis that he provides on Lovecraft. But yes, Brandig, do you want to talk anything about the character in particular?
Not especially.
Okay, so
one interesting thing about the characters, he says his parent, he doesn't really complain about his parents, except that they were in love and that he felt a bit excluded from them, from their circle. But he basically, it's kind of interesting. He doesn't sort of, like in other books we have the super kind of bohemian, single parent or something like that. But these ones, so maybe again that may point to the fact that there is like love between marital love is a possibility in this book. It's just that he missed his chances.
It also means that he can't use it as an excuse for what happens later on. This sort of familial issues as a cause of what's happened. And obviously, the death of his parents, his father discovers that he has cancer, so they both overdose together. Transgressive literature basically always has references to suicide, and I think it comes back to the Camus quote, which is it's essentially that you need to spend your time finding reasons not to kill yourself. It's kind of the absurdist opinion.
In the absence of God, like in an existential universe with no God, maybe you do, right?
Yeah, exactly. You see this kind of come through a lot in this book. So
he's a non-entity in his own book.
Well, yeah, he was dead from the start.
I think I do think this, this like these hints of love are important in the book, and he also has an interesting discourse on female love, which I thought kind of hit some home truths.
Everything that the main character laments is an abstraction and an idealization of something, which is not even remotely accurate or reflective of reality or tangible. And the romantic notions with which the main character is enamored, or I would actually, if he were enamored with them, he'd actually attempt to make some, movement in that direction. Enthralled, I guess, is a better word, or mildly interested, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
The main character doesn't understand the first thing about commitment and responsibility and a non-usurious relationship. So it's perfectly reasonable that he would have absolutely no experience or understanding or ability to love anyone, because there's no give and take or understanding or comprehension of the needs of other people anywhere inside of the reflections or actions of the main character throughout the book.
I've heard this criticism a lot, and I don't quite understand it. That he has an abstraction of women as opposed to sort of an authentic representation of how they were. But I the only person I see that with is the chestnut-haired girl, but that's the purpose that she serves, is sort of an idealized young woman that he could have found. But the other relationships which we're about to move on to, I don't see that being the case.
Yeah, I kind of think he does get at some things that are. I thought it was interesting when he was talking about how the way women love, and how it's sort of this, when a woman falls in love, how it's this sort of really radiant force that then kind of convinces the man, and it takes him a while, but then he starts to feel like, oh, maybe I'm lovable, and he starts to kind of find himself through this like incredible confidence that the woman has in this love,
Mm-hmm.
and
that's a psychological manifestation of a idealized reflection of reality.
Well, it does. Okay. It did. I have.
I mean, okay, we can argue. Yeah, I don't know.
I have noticed that women, when I have noticed that, like, women will sometimes, or a lot of the time, women think that men don't, they don't love the way women love, or they don't. But then when it comes to it, the man, if the man loses this woman who loves him, if he loses her, he's devastated in a way that the woman, might even be, she's surprised, right? How devastated he is. And he's really devastated because it takes him a while to warm up to the idea, and to sort of get used to the idea of really being attached to somebody. And then if the woman just yanks it away, then she finds out that it's not true, that he doesn't, I don't know. It struck a chord with me. What he was describing there was like the sort of intensity of a woman in love, and like how the man will like warm up, and then eventually might be, if it doesn't work out in the long term, then he might be the one who's really suffering. I thought that's what he kind of got at something there.
Yeah, it's that long-term relationships for women is sort of a birth and for men it's kind of at the beginning it's kind of becoming subservient, and then a realization that you enjoy the subservience. It's yeah, it's discussing power dynamics in relationships that we don't really see getting spoken about.
There's an entire field of psychology dedicated to that is really beyond the scope of this discussion.
Yeah, but we're not having this group to read textbooks on psychology. It's a representation in literature.
Or to discuss it, I guess.
Did I get okay?
Yeah, so no, for a moment it just popped your icon up on screen.
I mean, that's what most novels really, tend to engage with love a lot.
Well, they never do. They very rarely do it correctly or accurately or in a beneficial way. It's almost entirely and exclusively the realm of idealized love, which gives the reader a very poor understanding of actual human relationships and power dynamics within relationships.
That could be a problem with certain types of romanticism, certainly.
Well, speaking of love, let's go on to the slide. Ta-da! Look at that segue. I just pulled random pictures of people that vaguely met his description. So I think a couple of these people are models, but
those are pretty good.
Pretty close to what I had in my head as going through. So yeah, you could argue that some of these kind of get muddled up in some of his descriptions, but again, when this is a man that is essentially recalling his life, I do think that there might be intentionally muddling up of some of these relationships. The one that is obviously most distinct is Yuzu at the end here, because of his fallout with her. But they all kind of end in different ways in which he's responsible for each of them. But with Claire, he's not even particularly interested in a relationship. It's just sort of how we can a jumping off point to see where her life has gone. Oh.
The two middle ones are I think that he has a prospect of love, or he gets hints of love with those two ones. Claire and the two outer ones are more kind of bonk fests, right? Like they're
yeah, exactly.
And I think Claire is kind of typical of his. He has sometimes these female characters who are very poorly served by what we could call the sexual revolution, right? Like that.
Yeah.
It's one thing when they're young, but then once they hit a certain age, it just gets really brutal, and they don't have.
It's called the wall.
Yes, it's known as the wall, but they don't have like a husband, they don't have kids, they don't have. They're alone and they can't get laid anymore, barely. And in her case, she starts getting fat and drunk, and it's a disaster, right? Which again, I think these are that's something that women of the last couple of generations and our present really need to hear, because like women do not tend to learn about time, the reality. Like they know it in theory, but in reality they don't really. They're just told that they can have everything, they should put off everything, delay everything.
They've got about a decade,
and
that's about it.
Well, this is the thing. It's not like every relationship is awful. There are sprinkled throughout a couple of glimmers of hope, and that's what he's sort of getting at. Which the hope lies with the relationship that his parents had. The hope lies with the as you mentioned before, his old landlord who dies, and there's people at the funeral that genuinely cared for him, and he had a decent relationship with his family. These people are there. But he's not saying, "Oh, look at that! Look at what a good relationship." It's hinted throughout, but it's a little bit more subtle than just saying, "Boy, I wish I had a relationship like my parents." It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, but there are definitely. I mean, I really think it's kind of complex, right? Like there are definitely some lessons to be learned from men and women here.
Well, it's very difficult to learn any lessons without with the lesson only be don't do this.
Or
Only if you're dealing with stupid people. And I like, we've had this conversation before.
They
A lot
think
of people are stupid, but they're not going to be reading Houellebecq. They're not
Yeah.
reading.
They are if the general literature community recommends it as the novel, the preeminent novel by the preeminent French writer of our time.
Well, I'll tell you, in France, it's not like, again, they are more, they want you to read like really left-wing writers, and they're not happy that Houellebecq has achieved the kind of prominence that he's achieved. At least the people I know, they're very.
I get the distinct impression that that's basically being read out of pique. Pique.
Yeah.
Rather than actual interest in the subject matter. It's I'm going to read this to spite you, rather than I'm going to read this because I'm interested in it. Because that comports with everything I know about the French.
Yeah, no, I get what I'm saying is like that the mainstream intellectual movement and the mainstream intellects in France are very left wing, right? And they don't like Huelobeck. And he tends to get read more outside of France. Or like he definitely has a fan base in France, but the kind of he's considered very controversial, and not for the reasons that you think, not because he's naughty or that he's dark or whatever. It's because he doesn't sanction the left's solutions or their programs.
I would also say that on face value, I think this is. I still don't see it being a glorification of anything. At least with that argument, I could understand when we looked at Fight Club, because without a more nuanced understanding, there is glorification of violence and kind of expressions of masculinity that could be dangerous in there. Sure, but in this, nothing is portrayed as being good, bar these little glimmers that we see throughout. So I don't think it necessarily works.
Yeah, I agree. I think we see glimmers of the good life, and a lot to be avoided here.
What glimmers I've seen of the references to the good life are basically ephemeral and projections and idealizations with absolutely no relation whatsoever to what it actually is and or any inkling of how to achieve it. It's very similar to saying, wow, it was amazing that Americans made it to the moon. The moon was so great. It had all that cheese up there, and it was wonderful. And there was a man there, and he met them all, and it was great.
Well, come on,
but
now
I'm not in the moon.
Really went to the moon, did you?
I don't think that works. This isn't setting itself out to be an instruction manual to how to achieve happiness in life. This is
then it shouldn't be lauded as such a great work.
Who's saying that it is that? And why does it great work?
All of the poster comments were like, "This is the best novel of the time."
Well, are they?
I don't think it.
And I don't suppose you would have recommended it if it weren't a major French work. I mean, I cede to your authority and your understanding of this because I don't have pretty much anything to do with the French. So I assume if you're going to recommend a book that we read pertaining to French literature, that it would be either representative of or emblematic pertaining to it. So here we go. Rachel Donadio on The Atlantic. France's most provocative novelist has done it again. Louis Betty, Los Angeles Review of Books. Serotonin is at times hilarious, sexually graphic, and shockingly irreverent, but it is also a novel of moral seriousness, daring us to increase our compassion in proportion to the seemingly loathsomeness of those to whom it is owed.
Yeah.
The Economist. Houellebecq has once again managed to put his finger on modern French and Western society's wounds, and it hurts.
Well,
Well, I mean, is that untrue?
is that untrue? Yeah.
I don't think it's true.
That he's managed to put his finger on Western society's wounds and it hurts. Doesn't that sound about right?
I don't think that the main character epitomizes anything about any society.
Now you're contradicting yourself, and you're just being controversial.
What do you mean?
Well, because you did say that he diagnoses a certain situation. It's just that you're not happy that he's not explicitly offering an alternative, which I think is just not the style of today to explicitly offer an alternative. I think he's hinting at one and showing us glimmers of one.
I'm stating that this is not a core problem of Western philosophy or Western society. That people run around and have intercourse with all sorts of creatures.
It bloody is a core feature of Western society.
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not been my experience, and I have.
You're lucky because you're missing. This is quite. Have you heard about Tinder? This is quite standard stuff these days, and it has been since the '60s, right at the minimum.
Well, I grew up in the '80s, and I've not encountered any environments even remotely relating to this, nor have any of my people with whom I interact on a daily basis. And I interact with a good number of cross-section of people.
Okay, well, you're lucky, but this is fairly standard, like for Western society.
I can understand it might be fairly standard for leftists.
Yeah, but that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about.
Well, society is not majority leftist.
Well,
I hate to break it to leftists,
but they are in control to a large degree, and they're setting the tone. I mean, they're setting
control
the tone.
is an interesting word. It implies the ability to change things, which I don't think that the lefties are actually able to do.
I disagree with that. What do you think the Cultural Revolution was?
I think the Cultural Revolution was constrained entirely to the ruling class.
Yeah, but it's trickled down. Sure, it wasn't targeted at the lower classes, but the standards that were pushed then have definitely dripped into
the deeper it trickles, the less effective it is, and it's going to eventually reach the water table and then be rebuffed because oil doesn't mix with water.
That's what we all hope, but we're growing a little bit. We're growing a bit despondent on that account.
Well, you shouldn't.
Well, we keep hoping with Dr. Steve Turley that.
I don't know. I have yet to see that.
I can tell you that it would continue unabated as long as people decided not to rebuff things such as this. But I'm standing here saying no and rebuffing it and standing athwart. What is it? Stands athwart history and say no, or progress.
Mm-hmm.
But this isn't a cause. This is a symptom.
Well, just okay. Then condemn the book in 20 minutes and move on.
What do you want to be condemning the book?
I think that this is a book about a degenerate by a degenerate, reflecting degeneracy, and that it should be read in that context, if at all.
Okay. Well, let's take that premise. If I do read it in that context, could there not still be value within it?
Only in as much as you recognize, you see how it reinforces those premises. But given the vast majority of other more beneficial, more profitable things on which one can spend time, I can't really understand why one would want to spend the 4 or 5 hours it would take to read this book, given the subject matter that would not be better spent elsewhere.
Did our Dutch people get scared off by
Our Dutch people sent me as a proxy to plead their case that this book should be taken out back behind a woodshed and shot,
They were just
which I
offended.
believe one of them is going to be doing.
They're just offended by the
that was
reference.
not that was not one of our Dutch people, but there will be a shooting.
This,
I should really rephrase that. There'll be a shooting of the book.
I put the Swiss and the Dutch and the basically the
we
whole.
have one Dutch guy. We have a Swiss guy. We have another Dutch guy, don't we?
We've got two.
Yeah. Well,
Long story short,
so offended by that.
there are significantly better things on which to be spending time than reading this book about the degeneracy of the West, such as it is. And I would recommend Nietzsche before I would recommend this.
Have you made a book recommendation for us, Brandig?
I'm the one that recommended Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I've made a dozen or more recommendations to Albion over the last several years or two. So
this is not on the list. Can I just go back to something I mentioned earlier? I do want to get your opinion on this. Do you not think it's a valid point that Fight Club is more of a glorification of degeneracy than this is? Yeah, you do seem to prefer, although distastefully, Fight Club over this.
I'm considering the comparison. While I don't want to recommend Fight Club, it when it was done with respect to the way that it was done in the movies, it was very compelling. Because the final act, the redemption arc, whereas in the book that wasn't really all that redemptive. And yes, there was a glorification, and there was some more intense and distasteful glorification of violence, qua violence. This book, on the other hand, there's at least in Fight Club, the author was represented a character that was trying to better himself. I'm not going to say he went about it the best way possible, but there was at least an aim towards improvement. Whereas in this book, it's not an aim towards improvement; it's an aim towards destruction. And not only is it not destruction of the main character, it's as being as destructive as possible before the main character destroys himself. So this book I could see being referenced by a person who wants to go out and be a mass shooter. Whereas, I mean, I could see the same thing about Fight Club, but with Fight Club, again, the goal of the main character is improvement rather than just destruction. Whereas in this book, the main character's goal is solely destruction.
Well, in Fight Club, it's improvement through destruction.
I understand that, and there's a subtle difference, but there is that difference. And that's why I don't particularly like Fight Club either, because he's got the destruction part down, but there's no reconstruction or rebuilding or positive outcome of that, aside from self-improvement from the perspective of I feel better about myself, or I'm making a better world by destroying the evil. There's no making a better world by destroying evil does not let me get back. Simply destroying evil does not a better world make. If you destroy one evil, there's no guarantee that what fills the gap that was previously occupied by the evil will not itself be as evil or more evil. So
not to make this a Fight Club discussion, but I don't think he's trying to destroy evil in that. I think it's explicitly destroying beauty. But let's go back onto Serotonin.
Here's a quiz. What point okay, how can I phrase this? There's a point of similarity, a very specific point of similarity between Fight Club and Serotonin involving support groups. Brandig, you might not have gotten this. I don't know. Maybe you did hit this point. Do you remember the support group bit where I think it's Claire?
Oh, Alcoholics Anonymous for Claire.
And also when her mother dies, I think she goes to a support group for grieving. And she's like, that's when she finds out that she's a good actress.
Oh, yes.
That's the role of the grieving. Yeah, there's definitely. So, I mean, we see, like in both books, I think we see how support groups and Alcoholics Anonymous as well, and psychiatry, of course, have like trying to stand in for priests, family, friends. This kind of therapeutic culture, right?
Those are all performative relationships. This is all surface level repainting the fascia. As to your reference about Claire and her finding out she's a great actress, that implies then that what she's presenting to the support club is in fact a facade, and it doesn't touch or change the underlying Claire, which is kind of the point of the exercise.
No, it's true. It was just funny though.
And that goes back to I don't know, the entire leftist subgenre of literature is detached from reality in that it deals primarily with surface level things, surface level emotions, surface level relationships, surface level appearances, surface level values, statements, virtue signaling rather than virtual demonstration. All of that is surface level, and the leftist perspective of trying to disassociate the surface from the actual underlying reality is the core problem I have with it. The whole trans women are women thing. Just because one has the appearance of something does not indicate that thing is of that substance. So just because Claire acts as a grieving daughter does not mean she actually cares about her parents or is actually grieving their loss.
Well, no, that's the whole point.
No, that's the yeah, exactly. That's the point.
The point is she's playing the role of a grieving daughter, which means because she wasn't really grieving. That was the joke. It's
not a joke, I guess, is my point. There's nothing funny about that. And writing a book that makes that the joke does a disservice to everyone who's actually gone through that and actually had that experience.
I don't think making a joke about taboo subjects is necessarily demeaning to everyone that's gone through that.
You're missing my point. My point is, you can make a joke about it in certain contexts and understand that it is a dark joke and a bad joke and a black joke to use the parlance of black humor, but it is not something to be cast off or portrayed as a valid or important or what was the term, psychologically stunning or compelling narrative.
No, it's not. I mean, if that with people in the book who are grieving, because we do get more substantial people who do grieve in this book, and he points at the family who, we see depictions of people who have real families, relationships, who have religion, who are genuine, and it's not something that's sneered at. It's just something that's like behind glass for some reason. It seems like it definitely represents something good. But this character doesn't seem to have access to it. I mean, we could go back to the theme of serotonin and the antidepressants, right? That there's kind of, it's said that people are sometimes cut off from their emotions. That's, he's definitely cut off from his main pleasure in life, right? That's
Yeah,
sexual
yeah.
pleasure.
Well, it's you are as happy as you feel, or sorry, you feel as happy as you choose to feel. I mean, you can choose to, you can exercise a great deal more agency over your emotions and your feelings at a time as most people are than most people would believe.
Yeah, that's true. You can, and indeed, doing things like even lot of exercise and volunteer work and that kind of thing is probably more effective than taking any antidepressant. I think antidepressants in the book are also, they're also a problem. They're not a solution.
It's a surface level correction to a core problem that needs to be corrected. It's treating the symptoms, not the illness. And I don't like the critical acclaim or applause or I don't know, even if they're treating this as a countercultural piece of work, it still offends me that it's being lauded as much as it is. Unless it's being,
I'm sure we can dig up a bad review somewhere.
unless it's being advertised as a satirical attack on, the failings of modern liberal society, I think it's doing a disservice to the reader to advertise the book as one thing when it turns out it's another thing entirely.
This is just going to be something that we can't really patch up, because I don't agree with that idea. I don't understand why something you have to be told how you need to respond to a text before you go into it for it to have value.
To a positive value. This book, of course, has value. I'm not going to say it doesn't, because all books have value. The problem is that this provides a great deal of support to narratives that really should have as much support removed from them as possible.
Yeah, I don't agree. I think you're stronger. Your point that the depiction of something negative without a clear alternative or solution. I mean, I understand how you might not want to live through something sort of unremittingly dark. I understand that. I mean, but perhaps it's a matter of a little bit of taste, when you have a certain type of aesthetic, and perhaps also when you live through, I enjoy anything, perhaps because of having a lot of experience, of observing the type of society that he is satirizing, and I like to see it sort of given a hard time. I like to see, because it seems to me like it's triumphed. It seems to me like it's, I like to see, but I also, like, in the past, I used to take the position more that if I found something could, be more like a pure aesthete type position. But lately I have a little more sympathy for the forbidden books list. For the idea that maybe we shouldn't read. So I do have some more sympathy for that, like that maybe we shouldn't, read certain things, or maybe they're bad for us. But I'm not sure that this is the book that I would put on that list.
Well, there's a certain beauty in innocence, and reading this book will do nothing but tarnish that innocence if it doesn't destroy it utterly. And I can see, with the critical acclaim this book has received, with the popularization of it as a countercultural narrative in France, that it would be potentially advocated for in a group such as ours to be studied, that would basically potentially introduce elements that would tilling soil that are left undisturbed, for lack of a better term, particularly pertaining to some of the choices made by not necessarily the main character, but other characters in the book, or the main character himself, pertaining to his justification for taking his own life, or his justification for his disdain for life in general. You want to talk about Diary of an Incel? This was a guy who was having sex left, right, and center, and then he went on antidepressants and he became an incel. And life's not worth living, so I have to kill myself. Oh wait, that would leave stuff behind that's of value, so I have to destroy that first before I can then go kill myself. The book is just disgusting and terrible and awful across the board. And if it was written to be disgusting and terrible across the board, congratulations, you did a great job. If there are some little wisps of longing for something not disgusting and terrible across the board, well, they're there. Okay, that doesn't do anything to redeem the book sufficiently, in my mind, to warrant recommendation of reading it.
I mean, do you not think it's a fair the question that is posed in this and in existential ideas? Do you not think it's a fair question to ask it? What you're asking, why he'd want to kill himself, but do you not think that asking why they should not, with the absence of God in modernity, do you not think that's an idea that should have some exploration?
No, because while there is life, there is hope, and giving people and presenting the question to people without any kind of an answer invites them to come to the conclusion that there is no answer.
Well, what hope for what? Sorry,
redemption.
Okay, well,
but the idea is that without God, what is the redemption of what?
Finding God.
But then you've presupposed your own conclusion.
Yes. So I know it's hard to think that I might believe that we live in a world with an unmoved mover who started it.
That's not what I'm arguing. I'm saying that you've not actually taken the argument on in its own terms.
Of course I don't, because I reject its terms. I reject the premise that God doesn't exist, and I reject the premise that God needs to prove God's existence.
No, but we're not arguing against God's existence, and I don't think that Houellebecq is either. I think he's describing a character who is.
But the problem with the question as posed by the Albion is taking as a given the non-existence of God. Then the question is, why don't you kill yourself? Well, if that, then all we need to do to convince people to go kill themselves is to convince them that God doesn't exist, because we've got an already established narrative of why they should go kill themselves if God doesn't exist. Just hand them serotonin.
I mean, that's kind of the conclusion I draw.
So perhaps, given the prevalence of
the book, I'm confused.
Perhaps given the prevalence of the adoption of the premise within Western society, might we then say it would be a bad idea to popularize a roadmap for the conclusion to just go off and kill yourself, and better yet, wreak as much havoc and destruction as possible, or at least minimally destroy any benefit you've done to society before killing yourself?
It's more that in a world without, that's more that I think it just depends how explicit you need things to be. I mean, this, to me, he's constantly referring, there's constant, it's like the cutout, but there are constant references to God in here, and not in a dismissive or disgusting way. God is present in this book. He's just not saying, and you must, you should all go to church and read the Bible, right? He's not.
The only references to God I got that I gathered from the book was wistful wishes for God.
But if you're someone that is in that position, do you not think that could be of benefit?
No, because God never answers. God never appears. God never makes his manifests in any way, shape, or form. The main character is always left wanting.
Yeah.
The main character never has any realization or revelation or understanding or recognition of anything, even if there are situations which could be perceived as the act of, the hand of God, or circumstances allowing God to express himself. It's ignored by the main character. Therefore, if this is used as a template by individuals who, and again, this is not an anti-intellectual argument. This is not a anti-study argument. This is a anti-popularization argument.
Well, I don't think either me or Justine are arguing for it to be handed out to in classrooms.
We're presenting it as a magnum opus on the Magnum Opi podcast. So the question remains: why are we lauding this as an appropriate representative work of this author? Why this and not submission, or why this and not atomization?
Well, I mean, maybe we could have done. we could have done atomized.
And if those books are just as bad, then why are we covering this author?
They're not, but it's not. I don't know. Anyway, I think we've.
I'm fairly certain the horse is dead. Long live the horse.
So let's move on to his friend
Emmerich. Yellow vest.
Emmerich. So yes, so after an exploration of his previous love life, he goes to see Emmerich, however you pronounce that. And this is when it moves from the relationships to the sort of agricultural and anti-globalization arguments of the book, I suppose. Justine, do you want to cover it?
Well, his friend. I mean, I can talk a bit about his friend. This is the person who he met at uni, right? He describes as being his only male friend, or perhaps his closest friend. And he says that that your friendships, the ones that you make in school, perhaps university is what he says, are the most real relationships, are the most real friendships that you have, but you don't necessarily want to see them, and they never last. See, he makes sort of sweeping statements about how disappointing life is and how friendships never last, etc. Again, we're to take that with a grain of salt, because this is an unhappy person talking, right? But he is getting at something, which is that you have, like, in your youth, where everything seems possible, you have certain expectations about how your life might go, and then you necessarily kind of compare yourself with your closest friends, and you sort of see where they go. In the book, he tours mentally and literally around and sort of sees these people from his past, and he goes to visit Emmerich, who he talks about how he was surprised how serious he was in uni, and how he studied, what is it? Does he specifically study is it animal husbandry? I forget. Exactly.
Yes, it's animal husbandry.
Yeah. Whereas Florent is, he said he can't believe, like, he can't believe that any guy cares more about anything than girls, right? At that age, and he was sort of there are a few times in the book where he seems a little bit stunned by the fact that people have, compelling other interests, uh, apart from sex, essentially. Um, I do think that his interest in sex goes back again to this desire for something apart from like pleasure, like a desire for something transcendent. But he doesn't, and that's the most transcendent that he ever gets, where he feels union. But he doesn't really have the ability to understand that. But his friend has married and lives in a countryside he lives in the chateau. I think it's quite a large estate, so he has the opportunity to compare himself with the friend. And the friend is
Yes.
Yeah, you carry on.
Yeah. Well, we go through 3 different time frames, I think, when he's recalling his previous experiences with Amaric. And you sort of progressively see a loss of hope with the conversion of the chateau into a hotel, and it instead becomes they build these cheap, knocked up huts on the land instead to rent out. And I think in some ways he's a contrast to Florent, as he is trying to live up to the sort of ideals that he has when it comes to agriculture, as opposed to Florent, who kind of sold out and went to work for Monsanto. But in the end, because of we could argue the causes, but a lot of it is because of the globalization that France is facing. Both of them kind of come to the end of their tether, and he's going through a very messy divorce, and it leads to a section that Brandig you wouldn't have got to, but was being compared to the Yellow Vests is a sort of uprising of the farmers, a sort of publicity stunt which involves several of their deaths, to bring attention to the issues that French farmers are facing. And it's not actually explicitly said in the book, though it's hinted at. I did look up afterwards. It's estimated that every 2 days a French farmer commits suicide. And I think that in Australia, it's around the same. I don't know what it is for Britain, though. But there's a lot of suicide in agriculture.
Yeah, there's a lot of worry. It's sort of like a canary in the coal mine thing somehow, isn't it? Because agriculture is so deeply, bound up with our existence.
It's quite literally blood and soil. So,
yeah.
That is why it kind of foretells what might happen to the rest of the population. But
and French farmers are very good at protesting. Weren't they recently responsible for a massive spraying of manure all over the presidential residence in Paris? I think that was farmers. They were, but it was certainly farmers were involved. But that may have been over the
lockdowns.
Yeah, and specifically over the plans to introduce a pass for everything except for grocery stores. So you basically need to have a jab to go into restaurants. Yeah, which is worrying, I have to say.
I mean, I didn't fact check this, but I heard that even to be married now,
oh my gosh,
you have to get vaccinated. Which, if that's correct, that's kind of epitomizes the insanity.
Whoa. I mean, yes, it's hard to see how people don't suspect that this is whatever else it might be in terms of a pandemic, that it's a governing technique. I know maybe we're not meant to sound off about this on YouTube, right? It does seem like there's a new governing technique happening.
No, it's an old governing technique.
I guess getting people to I suppose or precedents. It's just
They haven't been around for several hundred years.
if we, I mean, I'm not interested in debating the, the actual
Efficacy,
the efficacy of it, or the actual nature of the virus, or any of that, but rather just the way that the current situation seems to be linked to a new governing mode, or a governing mode that is being potentially used globally. We can see it and being introduced in various ways in different countries around us, but it looks like it's going to be everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, a passport tied with your social credit system is not really out of the question. I think it's pretty likely.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, wait till they tie finances into that, and then require an RFID chip to do anything.
Well, I mean, they already have.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, an implanted RFID chip.
I mean, this is again something that I haven't double checked. I saw it pop up yesterday that 500,000 of Fuentes's money is being held because of
wow.
He's politically insensitive.
Well, we've definitely seen people in this country lose their bank accounts, haven't we?
Oh yeah, well, Laura Towler is obviously the prime example of that. But
yeah,
and again, whether or not people like or dislike these people is completely irrelevant. It's just that this is a precedent that's being set, and it's only going to get more restrictive.
And it always starts with somebody who, like many people, think is beyond the pale, and then creeps up.
Yeah, exactly. First they came for blah blah blah, so on and so forth.
Oh, it's only so and so. Well, that person is a little beyond the pale, and yeah.
Salami slicing.
Turning it back to the book, we can again see an opportunity that the author foregoes to allow any kind of an idealized or a positive vision inside the context of his book. The guy who chooses to do the right thing, marries, has a kid, is a productive member of society, he also gets screwed by society. And his marriage dissolves and everything's destroyed and awful. Again, why do we read this book?
Because again, that does happen sometimes,
Yeah.
You could do the best, you can make the best effort in the world, but sometimes life does screw you over.
And sometimes the larger processes are so overwhelming, like that is a problem in liberalism, right? That you can sort of say, well, everyone can do their own thing and practice their own religion and that kind of thing, but the larger trends are so great that you find yourself alone, and you kind of find yourself being peeled away from whatever it was that
Every interaction between humans is always between two humans, and both people on sides of the interaction can choose voluntarily the way they want to behave.
I really don't agree that the individual is the basic unit. I mean, we always lived in tribes. We never lived alone.
Okay, so explain to me the last time that the tribe actually did something. When did the tribe cut down that oak tree?
Yeah, but
or did the tribe appoint Tom and Harry to go and grab axes and cut down the oak tree?
I'm not going to renegotiate Ayn Rand's position, but I know what you're. There are individuals, right? But individuals didn't flit around in the forest by themselves. They lived in tribes. That's what I'm saying. That's the natural state. Families are the natural state. Tribes are the natural state, not just like a lone individual agreeing to do this or that. You're born into a family. You're never alone. And at the beginning, you're always born into a family, into a context. You already have a ruler when you're born. So anyway, I just think that the larger, often it's very hard. Like, you have to be quite determined in this in the present kind of climate, I say, we're looking at when everybody's going to church and everybody's forming families, a lot of people just fall into line. They form church, they go to church and form families. But when most people are not doing that thing, you kind of have to have a lot of personal determination and sort of, bloody mindedness, really, to keep doing that thing, despite the fact that, and divorce is like catching, people see one family get divorced and it catches. So these things have a knock-on effect. So it can be hard for individuals to persist in their contrary ways.
Well, the grass is always greener on the other side. I think is an issue that a lot of people seem to believe that. So they'll forego the family that they built for, in this case, a pianist.
Like, also people are kind of, they really have this idea that your personal feelings are paramount, and so they don't really learn that in marriage. Feelings kind of wax and wane, then they wax again. It's not like, so when you get married, you have more intense romantic feelings, and then there's a period where they could drop off for a while. And then if in their present world, if you feel attracted to someone else, a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, that means you're not in love with your husband anymore, and therefore, you should follow your heart. And your marriage fell apart. It didn't, wasn't really a marriage. That wasn't really your soulmate. You should, right? You'll have a bunch of people cheering you on to divorce and go off with this new person. And that's kind of the zeitgeist these days, right? So like, they don't learn that second person, could be just a passing fancy. That will probably just pass over you. You have to stick to it. People need to support you in your marriage, and then you go on, right? Like, that's the kind of,
because monogamy is oppressive.
Yeah. Like,
it limits your choice. And this is the problem with, sort of the idea of absolute freedom, I suppose, in this context. Sure, you can do it, but it does only concern itself with the individual, which isn't the best situation for the society as a whole.
Yeah, like, as soon as a woman in particular these days voices some kind of dissatisfaction with her marriage to people, she will find a chorus of people who are prepared to talk her out of her marriage. Men will get a little more disapproval, but they will still, find it that the general narrative is, follow, that part of your heart, or that other organ that you sometimes mistake for your heart, to your personal happiness instead of supporting you, right? So if the whole society around you tends to be atomized and tends towards individuation and tends to celebrate just personal feelings, which are by definition changeable, then it's not surprising that these marriages break down, even with the best intentions.
And this is all reflected in the book?
Well, yeah, I think
elements of it, yeah.
Yeah, elements, yeah.
So this we might want to move on pretty quickly from. If Brandig wasn't a fan already, then he's not going to appreciate it anymore with this discussion. Do you have anything to say with the inclusion of the German birdwatcher?
I'm feeling a little cold. I think we need to light a fire. and I hear German birdwatcher is excellent fuel.
Well, I thought we'd really have an interesting discussion about Lolita, because that one, I would argue, isn't a celebration of what I think I've said before, is not a celebration of pedophilia, but is a tragedy. But because it's so determined to be sort of an objective beauty despite its controversial subject matter, you could be horrified by it. Have you ever read it, Brandon?
No.
No, I haven't read it, and I have no intention of reading it.
No.
I can safely say that that's not going on the reading list. Although, I with your recommendation, I may look at it at some stage myself. I think I've put people through enough already.
Well, I would recommend it. Martin Amis has got quite a good introduction to Lolita, and he explains how it's a tragedy. It's a beautifully written book about nostalgia, I would say.
So when I was flicking through and putting my thoughts together of Serotonin, I kind of, after some of the discussions behind the scenes about why people dislike it, I kind of started putting an association of sort of songs like The Residents and Primus, some songs that are actively meant to be painful to listen to, that still may tell you something about art. That I think that there are a valid opinion that those kind of things aren't valuable, or the recent discussion with AA and about Andy Warhol, some of those art pieces, the sort of the discussion is not about the art necessarily, or it's kind of only valuable in the context in which it's being presented. I think this kind of meta art is valuable, but I understand people's arguments. Not really arguments against it, but people not seeing it as credible, I suppose.
John Dee is very good at presenting some redemptive points of modern art.
It's very redemptive for the artists. I'm sorry. Yeah. I thought you meant remunerative.
Yes.
I was more purist before, but I have been converted on some, not all of it, but I have been converted about some of the value in which you can kind of appreciate art purely through the context in which it's being presented. Sometimes that.
Hashtag not all. Warhol was a great artist in his way. I mean, he certainly also created an atmosphere where certain very good music could flourish, such as the Velvet Underground, which I think were one of the greats. Certainly way better than most of the rubbish in the
60s. Yes, I haven't got a critical response slide because I thought there's going to be enough of that going on during the stream.
That's the only slide to which I was looking forward.
You've been reading all the critical responses.
Yeah,
exactly. That more than anything else is my condemnation of this book.
Best book ever by everyone.
I am Oron.
Are there any other points to be made, character-specific ones, or as a whole? I think we've kind of addressed as a whole enough. Should we go into the ending? Obviously, Brandon, you did look at the end as well, so maybe we should discuss his kind of reaching out to God at the very last moment, and also whether or not he is dead at the end of the novel, or if that even matters. What do you think?
I must have skipped that part. Because, like I said, I read the last 10 pages, and the last 10 pages, it was basically, hey, I'm going to kill myself, and I want to jump off this building. But you know what? I still got money. I got $500,000, whatever, pounds or francs or whatever it is, that I haven't spent. So I'm going to go blow that on hookers and blow, and then I'll blow this joint.
It's the very last page. He reaches out to God.
Let's find that.
I have no recollection of that, although it's entirely possible I was just too disgusted to make the connection. And today I understood Christ's point of view and his repeated horror at the hardening of people's hearts. All of these things are signs, and they don't realize it. Must I really, on top of everything, give my life for these wretches? Do I really have to be explicit on that point? Apparently so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's an association with his friend, and in some ways him, but I don't quite know what he's sacrificing himself for. Obviously, I could be argued that he's not, but I think it's an interesting passage to end a novel of this type on.
Indeed. God takes care of us. He thinks of us every minute and gives us instructions that are sometimes very precise. The surges of love that flow into our chests and take our breath away. Those illuminations, those ecstasies, inexplicable if we consider our biological nature, our status as simple primates, are extremely clear signs. And again, and today I understand Christ's point of view and his repeated horror at the hardening of people's hearts. Yeah,
well,
I think that's, you cannot say that God is absent. And I would say by definition, I mean, the question is to whether he's dead. There's interesting things in the narrative that suggest that he's talking. For example, he corrects himself a few times.
Yes, but at the very beginning, within the first 50 pages, I believe, he does make a note to say, he clarifies something to say and says for my lower class readers or something. So there's also
so the readers are present.
An understanding of the reader. I don't know, but again, I don't necessarily think it matters whether or not he's dead in his physical sense, because he is essentially spiritually dead already. Anyway, let's wrap up. I think we've beaten that.
We've been going for a couple of hours, but we've covered some interesting ground. Ooh.
Yes. So next on the list, the 5th of September will be Moby Dick.
Much better book.
Hopefully with a larger cast. I deplore these protests of people not coming on. It's a good discussion, and hopefully see everyone again next time, and maybe a less controversial book.
Well, look forward to that.
All right, take care, everybody. Don't read this book.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.